No, no buzz. Just Bees Book Club. Um, I recently went on a little trip and went to a little bookstore that I'd never been to before, in a place I'd never been to before, and was browsing around and I found Victorian Ghost Stories by Flame Tree 451 Publishing. Seem to be based out of Fulham in London. Um, Cute little spot. I have an extremely soft spot for the Victorian Ghost Story, so I picked it up. Just a little $6, I paid money for a book, um, and I had a really good time with it. It's it, it The Victorian Ghost Story is a tradition dating back to Victorian England. They're often told at Christmas. Probably the famous one is the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, but other big names include M.R. James is probably my a number one guy. Oh wow, Edith Nesbit wrote a handful of them alongside of her more famous children's fiction. I'm like blanking on the names, even though like half of them are like pretty big ones. So Jerome K. Jerome, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, Verdon Lee, Algernon Blackwood, probably the other sort of biggest one known like specifically for that niche, I think. But I've always just had like a real soft spot for these weird, goofy ghost stories. Partially because I think I initially came to them through weird fiction, which I came through the new weird in the early or late 2000s, early 2010s, through like Mayville and Vandermeer. Track that back to Lovecraft. Read a shit ton of Lovecraft while I was working a desk job because it's all public domain, and you can just bring that up on your computer, and it looks like you're working. At least if no one looks too close, especially if you're working with words like I was. And then through that, finding some of Lovecraft's influences, having a very, shall we say, complicated relationship with the Lovecraft stories. Not avoiding the ones like what is the famous one, the horror at Red Hook, the like collaborative absolute disaster. I think it's called like Medusa's Hair is among the most just like extremely racist things I've ever read in my life. That one, and there's the Mound or something like that. Just like truly just like, if you think the horror at Red Hook is bad, some of his collaborative works is just like yo. But then through that, finding some of the things that he was cited as influences, I think primary among them. I think I did one of these on this. I reread it sometime this year or last year. The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson is more pre-weird or proto-weird than it is Victorian Ghost Story, but like that's one of my favorite books probably of all time. Top 20, absolutely, I would say. The other side of that was getting into M.R. James and just being like, M.R. James fucking rules. These are fun. I really enjoy these. And my general experience with Victorian Ghost Stories since then has been like, even if I don't think they're particularly good, I have a pretty good time with them. So I picked this book up and I read it, and I agree with my past self in terms of this book. There's some really good stuff in here. There's some mediocre stuff in here, but nothing I was ever like, I'm not having a good time reading this goofy ghost story that's not really scary, but a little creepy. And I decided that I was going to take notes on all these. So I got notes on all these because I read this a little bit ago, as I'm perpetually backlogged, even though I'm also recorded through the end of the year and doubled at this point, or almost. If you're a bee, like I guess you have to be here, I suppose you would know that in a past life I was a writer, and I wrote a lot for Strange Horizons, and I wrote a lot of reviews of, not a lot of, a handful of reviews of anthologies of mostly speculative fiction for Strange Horizons. And if you go back to any of those, you'd know that one of the things that I tend to do when I read an anthology is to try to piece it together in a way, like to try to understand the argument that it is making, or to sort of pull out the threads of ideology that like lead to its construction in the way that it is. And I'm not going to do that this time. I really like doing that. I think probably my strongest version of that was reading Menial, Skilled Labor in Science Fiction, a short story collection, I think put out by Crossed Genres Press, that is probably out of print, even though it was ebook only at this point. I don't know if that's how that works, but I'm pretty sure Crossed Genres fell apart in some way or another a number of years ago, and maybe you can still pick it up on Amazon or something like that, but I don't know. But I really love that anthology, and I thought it did a fantastic job of constructing itself in a way to highlight the stories at their best, and also to sort of develop its own identity as an anthology. And I just don't think that Victorian Ghost Stories does that. It contains stories. The oldest is from 1854. The latest is from 1924. I believe those are two of the best of them in my memory, actually. But I don't want to go through them in order. I want to go through them in the order of my least to most favorites. So, I gave these all a rating in terms from 1 to 4 stars, and I did not order them in my notebook, so I'm going to flip through real quick. Let's see. Yeah. So we've only got 2 1-star stories in here, and neither of them are bad. They also had happened to be the last 2 stories in here, which was kind of a bummer. I should also say that the thing I did appreciate about this is that after the end of the stories, in this little Flame Tree 451 edition, we have pretty decent little biographies that give you the original publication date of the story, and then a little bit of biography, I guess. The funnest one of was the first story is by Sabine Baringold, and the first sense of it is the Devon-born clergyman S. Baringold is most famous as author of the hymn "Onward Christian Soldiers." The dude who wrote "Onward Christian," like the lyrics, I guess, to "Onward Christian Soldiers." Just wrote a pretty good little horror story. And then the other thing I appreciated is after the biographies, we've got a selection of fantastic reads, a range of gothic novels, horror, crime, mystery, fantasy, adventure, dystopia, utopia, science fiction, and more. And it turns out that these are all things that Flame Tree is also republishing, but there's like some really good stuff. It starts with The Castle of Otranto, which I've never read, but I do have a copy of. And just goes basically linearly through time. A bunch of little wrecks of books. So it goes from like 1764 to 1959, and then a handful of like myth collections. I don't really know what the deal is with them, but I thought that was a neat little resource. So, the stories. The second to last story in the collection, my first 1-star story, is A Wicked Voice by Vernon Lee, which is a bummer because I've heard the name Vernon Lee a bunch and I never read anything. My précis on it. A composer scholar who hates singers starts hearing a lot about an 18th century singer named Zaffarino, who could kill with 3 songs. A mysterious voice haunts the composer. Who could say? There's a lot of things in it that I wish I liked more, is probably why it's a 1-star. It's set in Venice, which you don't really get from these sorts of stories. There's a big musical angle, which you sometimes get, but that's usually not like historical music. The narrator is very opinionated in ways that one doesn't see. But I just didn't really find any of it to land for me. Didn't get real spooky. Didn't get real interesting historically. I'll come back to this repeatedly, especially as I get toward the end of this video. The focus on architecture felt pretty lacking, and just like general landscape stuff. It wasn't very descriptive in the way that I really appreciate in the best of these sorts of stories. And that was kind of just my takeaway. And then the other is also a big name. The other one I gave 1-star to is Man-Sized in Marble by Edith Nesbit. The Pressy I wrote for that one is newlyweds shack up near a church with marble knights that allegedly walk around on Halloween back to their house. Wife dies. There's a couple of really good moments in this, specifically the titular line. I didn't pull the quote. I'm not going to flip through it right now. But there's like one of the big plot the plot mover here is like this couple, moves in together in a little cottage because they're not rich, but they fucking English people in the Victorian period, so they can just buy a cottage or whatever. Meaning that these are all about they're about wealthy people. They are, aristocracy, in some form or fashion. Not, immediate in the court, maybe, but and they like find this housekeeper basically who's wonderful, but the housekeeper, like the big plot mover is the housekeeper is like, I need to go back. My kid's sick. And they're like, your kid's always sick. Your kid's been sick since you moved in. And she's like, I need to leave. And then that's how they discover the thing. And there's a moment when the man of the house is talking to the housekeeper and he mentions the like statues in the church, and she says, those man-sized knights in marble. And the narrator basically goes like, damn, that's a pretty good turn of phrase. Which I appreciated that. Love a narrator just being like, damn, that was pretty good. From that character made a turn of phrase that I quite like. I think the narrator is first person POV from the man of the house's perspective also, so it's sort of doing character work as well. Yeah, things that didn't work for me. I don't know, the style in general, like aside from that one moment, the rest of the narration just was like kind of like, it didn't feel quite right. And I think I said this is Edith Nesbit, another person whose writing I've been like recommended a million times, and maybe that plays into it a little bit. Okay, on to the 2 stars. Damn, we got half of the big hitters right up here, huh? We have the third story in the collection, The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. I went really back and forth on this one. I initially did a 3-star, and then I pulled it down to 2, and now I'm like, maybe it was actually a 3. My Prestige. Shorthouse's Aunt Julia has procured the keys to the local haunted house, where it is rumored a stableman murdered his mistress. They try to spend the night. This one, I think, suffers from the previous 2 stories. I think I look at me saying I'm not going to do critique of the order and then immediately jumping into it. I think the story would have actually really benefited by coming first in this anthology, just because the first 2 stories are absolute heaters, and this one has a lot of really good stuff in it. Like I said, I would be referring to repeatedly. One of the things I love about these stories is the way in which it gives the narrator a reason to be hyper-specific about a house, in a way that, you mostly associate with like haunted house fiction, and that is, sometimes these are haunted house, but even when they're not, a lot of these stories will just be like, here's the wing, and here's the ladder in relation to the wing, and here's why it isn't quite tall enough to reach this window, and therefore here's the consequences of that, or this part of the house was built at this period, and this part was built, like, just like hyper specific details that like aren't even things I like glean something from necessarily. I just enjoy reading them. And there is a bit of that in this story when they go into the haunted house. There's an interesting interplay between the 2 characters, which is not a thing. I think I'm talking myself into saying this is actually a 3-star story. Oops. The Shorthouse and his Aunt Julia have this like genuine connection that you don't see a lot in these stories because they're not necessarily about that. But overall, it just kind of felt like it ran the numbers. And maybe this is just an issue of me not having read more Algernon Blackwood, because I do extremely intend to read more of him at some point. But like, maybe I just sort of, I was in someone else's style as I was reading this. That's maybe a generous way to put it. But yeah, not one of the best. Next 2-star is The Phantom Coach by Amelia Edwards. My proceed. A newly married man gets lost on a cold night while grouse hunting, but gets led to a solitary hermit. They discourse. Uh, they discourse, but he wants to leave because his wife is worried, and luckily the mail is coming through. He catches a doomed ride in the titular vehicle. Um, yeah, this is I appreciated the setting for this one. I feel like I haven't read a ton of ghost stories in this sort of vernacular that are um, primarily set outside. You often get howling winter winds because again these are often told Christmas time. But those winter winds are usually told from the comfort of a fire with a glass of brandy, right? This is I don't actually remember if they're okay because the other thing I'm not doing here is talking about the thing that is like my favorite part of this is these almost always frame narratives that have like start with wait yeah wait no I'm on the Phantom Coach now. Yeah, confused. Yeah, so this is actually a thing that is worth saying. So this one opens. The circumstances I'm about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on the subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Many of these stories open in this way. They open as though they were to be told over a campfire, for instance, right? Or that would be our more the more American version of this, right? Because what they often do is actually very explicitly situate the narrator, like I said, in front of a roaring fire in a fireplace around Christmas time or in fall with a drink of some kind. And the lack of that specific context in that opening paragraph that I just read is like sort of indicative to me of what I fell short in the Phantom Coach for me. Even though I was just saying that I was going to praise the setting. An extremely important part of these stories to me is specificity, which breeds something that I can't quite put my finger on. The sort of obvious reach here would be what's the word for when you are immersed in something? Immersion. That is not an issue for me. Meaning it's not a thing I go for personally. It's not that I feel more immersed in a setting. And the other side of this is like I think I've probably talked about this, and bees know. Apophenia is a thing. It's not the accretion of words directed to images is not a function my brain processes really. I do not close my eyes and I do not think I will see a red door with a blue handle. I see the back of my eyelids. That's all there is there. I thought forever that this was just how people worked. It's not. That wasn't all metaphors. I like metaphors now a lot because I thought for a long time that metaphors were just the way that you understood things like that. But other people have different ways of processing visual information in their brain, apparently. So all to say, this is not because I need to visualize myself inside a Victorian parlor with a glass of a snifter of brandy or a shot of rye or whatever to like get immersed into the story and feel all of its effects. I just like it when the words do things together in interesting ways, and I find they tend to be much more interesting with that specificity than without it. Than say with this opening, right? That I'm talking about specifically, the Phantom Coach. That seems to me like you are writing a story to tell wherever. That like it feels almost like, you know, one might memorize this to tell at a you know, summer camp or whatever. I've never been to a summer camp, so you know. But to get back to what I was saying in praise, I do love that much of the story takes place on a trudge through a snowstorm, because I feel like most of these don't. Most of them take place in a parlor, with sort of flashes to other parlors, or maybe a run through a cobblestone street at night. There might be a coach, but it's probably screaming by a tavern or dropping one off at it. It's a lot of interiors in these stories, and I appreciated the use of an exterior. But otherwise, and there's also like a when I say they discourse, this like hermit is like a huge philosophy and science nerd, and it's like, what are all these advances? What are all these advances? And they talk about a bunch of guys, and then he's like, all right, well, go catch the mail truck, and don't catch the ghost truck, or not truck, but carriage. And then he catches the ghost carriage. Spooky. Yeah, that was, again, 2 stars. I just enjoy the genre, so even when it's bad, I like it. And that's the only ones. Is that right? Yep, so Algernon Black, that's yeah, to recap. So far we have Vernon Lee and Edith Nesbitt in last place. We've got Algernon Blackwood and Amelia Edwards tied for third. And then we're going on to our 3-star stories. And we start with the first story in the collection, On the Leads by Sabine Baringgold, aforementioned author of Onward Christian Soldier. My Pressy. At Fernwood, the apparition of a woman runs up and down the roof of the west wing of an H-shaped estate. Yeah, so this guy decides he wants to buy, I think this is also a grouse hunting thing. He decides he wants to buy a house. He sees one that seems cool. He wants to buy it now so he can go on his hunt. It might not be a grouse hunt, it might be some other kind of hunt. But he wants to go hunting and decides he wants to, or rent the house for a period to see if it's suitable, and he wants to rent it right away. And the proprietor's like, well, couldn't you come back in like December? It's like November. Could you come back in like December? And he's like, no, I want it now because I'm a rich British man who wants to go hunting. The servants at one point refuse to walk down an alleyway to their quarters because there is something casting shadows through a window that leads to the roof. It turns out to be an apparition, and there's the misdirect where the narrator can't get through the window. This is actually what I was explicitly referencing when I was talking about, like, here's the wing that was built when, and here's the ladder and how it doesn't quite reach the particular window. I was literally referencing this story. He like goes up on a bluff around the corner, and sees this apparition gallivanting up and down the roof, and then sort of turns away and turns back, and she's gone. And then he sees like a chunk of firewood, or like some contractors see a chunk of firewood the next day, and they're like, oh, it was probably just that rattling around. And then it happens again, and I really liked how this one ended. It's very funny to me. I think speaks to the ways in which these stories were probably meant differently depending on the story, because the resolution to the story is just like, they opened up the east wing or the west wing or whichever one it was not, and then like the work got faulty and that wing burnt down, and he's like, yeah, so I bought the place because the wing burnt down and there was no more ghosts. Just like goofy ending. And yeah, again, this is probably the number one of like the just heavy specificity of the description of the house is like so my shit. And it's just a story that's just like, and here's the logistics of this house. And I just like stories that are the logistics of a house. And if you put a ghost in them, that's great too, you know? So yeah, skipping that one. Come back to it. Then we have The Signal Man by Charles Dickens. My Pressy. A man visits a signalman who finds his halloa distressing as he's heard it before. A gesture is repeated. This one is good. Yeah, it's there's a guy who sees like a signalman for a train. I guess like he has a little box near the tracks near the exit of a tunnel. He's like the person who holds out a flag and waves it and goes like, "Hey, there's a fucking train coming. Get out of the tracks." And he like reports things back like on a telegraph back and forth like up to the stations, presumably before the tunnel and at some distance down the track. The main or the POV character hails him in this way: "Hello down there." I don't know what Halloa. I don't know what hello. I'm not gonna go farther down that path. The signalman seems to find that a distressing call, but they chat for a little bit, and the signalman says like, I know I'm seeming a little off, but I'll tell you tomorrow if you want to come visit. And the guy's like, hell yeah, I want to come visit. I want to hear more stories about being a signalman. That's cool. And then they talk again, and the signalman basically says, why did you say the thing you said? And he's like, well, because I saw, it's like hello below there or something like that. And the POV character's like, well, I saw you below me and I wanted to hail you, so hello below there. And the guy's like, you sure it wasn't like a spirit or something? And the POV character's like, maybe he's not, maybe he needs some help, maybe he's going a little kooky because he's been so isolated. And they chat for a while, and the signalman tells him that he's seen an apparition going like this. Left arm in front of his eyes, right arm waving frantically and saying the phrase that the signalman said. Hello below there, or something like that. Down there, whatever it is. And the POV character is like a rational scientific man, post-enlightenment, and is like trying to figure out a way to talk the signalman out of whatever it is, and the signalman is just going more and more like, I've seen multiple crashes, I've seen these apparitions appear before both of them, I just don't know how to take this sign. And then ghost story. Turns out next night when the POV character goes down to meet the signalman, there's been an accident. But before he sees the accident, he sees a man at the exit of the cave, at the mouth of the cave, his left arm covering his eyes, and his right arm waving back and forth. And he's like, what the fuck is happening? And he goes down. It turns out the man doing that is the conductor, and that was the gesture he had made when he saw that the signalman was still on the tracks, but was not responding to his whistle. He covered his eyes because he was so scared, and he waved his hand and yelled, hello below there, and then some other stuff that was that I don't remember because it was like a thing that the POV character made up. Anyway, it's a good time. I'm not a huge Dickens person. I think I read Tale of Two Cities in like high school, and that's like kind of it. I've seen A Christmas Carol in like repertory theaters or whatever like a billion times because that was like my family growing up's thing. By which I mean I've never really paid attention to Christmas Carol. And it's good repeated use of the gesture I think is like what brings this story up to me, because that's another thing I feel like these things can do. You impart significance into a strange thing via ghost, and then you explain it, but you don't explain everything, and that's where the spooky stuff happens. All right, moving on from Charles to The Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome. Another name I had heard of a number of times but never listened to anything by or read anything by. I also tend to listen to these things on YouTube pretty often if I'm just like kind of spacing. There's a lot of decent readings of them. I'm assuming all of these are probably in public domain, which is how this book got made also. Yeah, The Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome. My Précis. A man meets an old acquaintance who has been dead for 6 months. This never comes up again. A spiritualist tells the story of a wronged man chasing the man who did him wrong, and his sudden heart attack at the moment he catches him. The wrong man, the wronger becomes a man of science and procures a spooky skeleton. It's weirdly an adventure story. There's just like a lot of moving pieces in this story in a way that I do not associate with this genre at all. And that's like not to say that this never happens, but and I'm not to say I'm like an expert on it by any means. But like I don't know, maybe this is like there's more of a bit of Poe in here than I'm used to or something like that. But yeah, there's like a huge like cross-continental race that happens in the middle of this, and it's like it's explicitly said that like the wronged man, the man who becomes the man of science in the back quarter of the story or whatever, oh no, sorry, the man who did wrong is the man who becomes the man of science. The titular man of science is like, you know, it's rumored that there was something to do with a woman, but no one really knows. But they would engage in this chase that went forever, or like for years potentially. And the big like climax of that section is like the man who did wrong is in a church praying because he knows he's about to be caught, and he sees the man who he did wrong to approach him and like grin, having finally achieved his ends. And then the man who had been wronged has a heart attack and dies suddenly. And the man who did wrong repents in church, thanks the Lord, and goes on to be a man of science in order to fix his wrongdoings. He has a skeleton for a long time because I guess at this point a man of science means a skeleton in his house. And then the skeleton gets all old and busted, and he has to get a new one, and he gets it from like a kind of shady procurement process. And then the skeleton strangles him and kills him. Spoilers. This one was like fun in a very different way. I feel like this one was like kind of a breath of fresh air in a way. Like so many of these have very similar like Titan structures, and I thought this one, like the thing I mentioned at the front, the way it opens is just like it gives you the like the normal setup for these sorts of things. So somebody addresses somebody else saying, I just found out that this person I was walking around with just not 2 weeks ago has been dead 6 months. And then somebody else is just like, hey yo, have you heard the one about the wronged man and the man who wronged him though? Because shut the fuck up, I'm gonna tell you that story. Which is just, it's nice. Next story, which is also the next story in the collection Victorian Ghost Stories by Flametree 451 Publishing. Damn, this is going longer than I thought it was going to go. Thurnley Abbey by Percival Landon. Here's my pressy. A British colonial meets a gentleman on a boat on his way to London before departing for India. The gentleman tells him of an acquaintance who moved to Turnbull Abbey and invited him some years before, after asking... This one's twisty. A British colonial meets a gentleman on a boat on his way to London before departing for India. The gentleman tells him of an acquaintance who moved to Thurnbull Abbey and invited him some years before after asking to share the colonist's cabin. A real fucked up ghost story convinces the colonizer to let the gentleman stay the night. This one, this is a strong 3-star in terms of it having like 3 nested narratives inside of it, which I have fun with, but is I don't think great. The absolutely boiled down version is like 2 dudes on a ferry, I think, or on a ferry or a train. It doesn't really matter. Have this conversation, and the dude who's not the initial narrator becomes the narrator to tell the story of this guy he once knew who was like all hale and hearty, and then he's like, I'm gonna get married, or he's like, you know, another colonizer in India, and he like loves it out there, and then he moves back home unexpectedly, falls in love, and moves into his old ancestral house, and sort of becomes less and less hale and hearty as time goes on, and then eventually gets the secondary, the trinary, whatever, narrator to come by and stay the night, because at one point that narrator had said You know, if you were ever to meet a ghost, you would talk to him. You'd speak to him because he knows that the laws of ghosts are such that the ghost can't do anything until it's spoken to first, which is a law of ghosts I've never heard before personally. But you know, spiritualists, 19th century, they got all kinds of laws. Um, Instead, what happens is this apparition appears, and the dude has been invited to Thurnball Abbey, gets real scared, and then is like, "Is this a prank?" and beats the shit out of this ghost, which is like a skeleton with a veil of a nun. Uh, and then he like grabs the jawbone and runs into the host's house or the host's room, and like is like, "Hey, fuck you, you devil." There's like blanked out words in here for some reason. I'm assuming they're all devil or damn because they're all D dash 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 whatever. And then the like wife comes in and they're like, "Oh my god, what's happening? What's happening?" And they hear something shuffling down the hall and they're like, "Oh fuck!" And they throw the jawbone out and then like to the door, and they all get too scared and close their eyes when the door creaks open, and then the thing shuffles off, and the jawbone is gone. And he's like, "Well, I guess it wasn't a prank after all. And now, can I please sleep in your cabin? Because I'm a scared." And then they do. So yeah, that was Thurnley Abbey by Percival Landon, and one of the names I didn't ever hear before. And we got our last 3-star, according to me, story: Wicked Captain Walshaw of Walling by ya boy Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, author of, you know, Carmilla. I haven't read it. I kind of really want to. Let's go ahead and do my précis. A venal false captain terrorizes everyone around him until his wife dies and her servant curses him. The storyteller's uncle goes to claim the estate, but the lease is missing. Parenthetically, after he lives another 40 gout-struck years. The cursing candle is inadvertently burned, and a very good haunting ensues. I don't think I need to I don't need to go all the way into this one, because it's a lot of the same stuff I just said about the Percival Landon one. I would say the specific haunting that happens. I actually like both of them in very different ways. I was going to say it's better, but I like both of them in very different ways. Where the Percival Landon haunting is distinctly material, which is the thing I appreciate in a ghost story. The Le Fanu is much more sort of classic ghost with a twist. Not even really a twist, honestly. Just like a really good classic haunting moment. They both take place at the foot of a bed. They both revolve around a fire. And yeah, I don't know. It's also written in chapters, which is like I think the only one in here. It's like 5 or 6 chapters. They're all pretty great. Yeah, good story. So, I guess to do the recap, we got Sabine Baring Gold. We got Charles Dickens. We got Jerome K. Jerome, Percival Landon, and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. All tied for second place in terms of these stories. So, well, let's get to my favorite stories. I was going to say the best stories. They're my favorite stories. I don't give a shit. The Face by E.F. Benson. I read the back of it. I don't remember anything about E.F. Benson. Pretty sure I'd never heard of them before. This is the second story in the collection. It is probably my single favorite. My précis. Happily married Hester Ward's childhood recurring nightmares come back to haunt her until she sees the man's face in a painting. The story's great. I've never heard of it, never heard of Benson before. It is just like a nice slow burn with like a beautiful ambiguous payoff that is like not actually ambiguous at all. But yeah, it's like this happily married woman just having these dreams that are like really well described. Again, good use of specificity in both landscape and architecture, which I think I deeply appreciate in these style of stories. And genuinely spooky in places. I'm not a person who gets scared by fiction in pretty much any way. So, like, you know, mileage varies and et cetera, et cetera. But, like, just, like, banger of atmosphere. Love a spooky painting, you know? Who doesn't love a spooky painting? Come on. Yeah, again, like, real solid ending. Just all around joy. I'm sure somebody has read it on the internet somewhere, or posted it at the very least, or most. Actually, I would invert those personally. But 4-star story number 2 is The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. A nursemaid tells some children the story of their mother's story in Furnival after her parents' death. A crying child in the snow, a raucous organ player, and the vicissitudes of youthful love and revenge. This is another one of those, like, what was the one I specifically called out as being, I guess, like, sort of like the Man of Science, that, like, got probably one too many layers, but it works. This one works even better for me in that case. You know, man, there's, like, a really fun haunting where it's just like, oh man, the organ plays at night, and the nursemaid who is at that point, you know, is old when telling the story to these children, but is young at the point of the story that is being told, is like, oh, I wonder who's playing those, and then gets, like, the indication, like, oh, it might be a haunting, and she's like, oh, I don't know about that, and then she checks the inside, and all the keys are all fucked up, and all the machinery is busted, but it still plays at night, and this sort of, like, escalates a few times. Has big Leech vibes by Hiram Ennis, in terms of just, like, the driving snow outside of the shitty manor. Just you know, a good setting for a story, especially one that's spooky. Yeah, absolute banger. Just good diction in it also, as I recall. We got The Mezzotint by M.R. James. Let's see what I said right there. See what I said right there? Oop. Washed out. It was there for a second. I wrote IYKYK, man. Not man. Come on. If you know, you know. Like, this is probably second most famous story of M.R. James's. I think I would put A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, like A+, top tier, S+ tier. Mezzotint right up there. Again, haunted painting, great shit. Haunted mezzotint, I guess, technically. An unsolved mystery, nested, layered story, a very deep and detailed description of a place. Like, got it all. Absolute banger. Read M.R. James. Read more M.R. James. And that's it. That's the last one. So, our first place players are E.F. Benson, Elizabeth Gaskell, and the man himself, M.R. James. I think all these people probably sucked also, just to be extremely clear. They're fucking Victorian royalty, like, yeah. This is not an endorsement of any political program involved in any of these stories. Yeah, I had a lovely time with this little collection. Most of these stories are extremely available. If you are a bee, then you probably have some inclination for a spooky story by a weird old British guy. Just indulge us sometimes. Thanks for not watching.